Hey, what's up? In this video, I want to continue the series of my full round trip editing process, and today we're diving deep into color grading. This shoot that I'm covering came from a recent series that I just shot over Thanksgiving, and I was super stoked on how the images turned out. But it wasn't a paid shoot, so I felt like it was a good time to capitalize on this opportunity to share my full editing process with you guys. So we're only going to be editing 3 images because I don't want to make this video too long, and I want you to get and understand all the concepts that I'm going to be sharing with you. But all the images that are going to be edited within this video are linked in the description, so there's a link there. You can go grab them, download them. I do want to highlight though that these images are specifically for editing purposes. These are not for your portfolio, not for your social media to share. So I would appreciate it if you respected that, because I want to continue to give like this in good faith and do more videos just like this. So please, only for editing process. That'd be great. Thanks. Okay, so now that you got the downloads, let's go to Lightroom. Okay, so the first image that we're starting off with here is going to set the tone for the rest of the images, and I love this photo so much for a few reasons. I love it because it's flattering to the rider. The sun is managed behind the rider's arm, as well as the environment is going to be really great to work with. You know, we can really pump in those complementary colors between those really warm trees and then that blue sky, so we can really try to push this complementary color. So trying to accomplish this teal and orange look is not going to be very hard for us. So let's get into it, and we'll start off with the basics and then we'll kind of go from there. Okay, so the first thing that I'm focusing on is going into the basics tab here. So generally when I'm starting off is I like to zoom in and just make sure that my white balance is on point. So if you're not too familiar with controlling your white balance, then you can go up to this color picker here and you can go to a point that was black in your image. This is black for me. So what this does is it neutralizes the whites and it neutralizes the blacks. I'm finding that that worked fairly well. I'm noticing that it is a little bit blue within these whites. So I'm just going to grab the temperature slider, just bring it up a hair. Now the whites are starting to look more neutralized, and the blacks as well that are true black. So we're gonna go zoom out, and this is what we're gonna start off with here. So generally what I like to do is just work my way from top to bottom. So I'm gonna work with the exposure first. Gonna really bring that up, make sure that my rider is nice and bright, making sure that I'm not blowing out the highlights too much there. We'll control those as well. I like to boost the contrast just to give a little bit more depth between my rider and the background. And I like to boost my contrast up enough. So I'm gonna go to about plus 24. It just really makes the environment pop all together instead of just having a very flat looking image. So I'm gonna bring down those highlights there. We're gonna bloom out these highlights a little bit more. I'll show you how I do that within a mask, but we're just gonna pull those down for now. And generally when I'm working on highlights and whites, I like to do those together, and then shadows and blacks, I do those together because the highlights and the whites work together. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull down these whites, and I really generally like to do that pulling down the whites because it kind of takes the sting out of those whites and those highlights. And let me show you what I mean by that. So if I were to pull these highlights up, look at how much it just draws attention outside of my subject here altogether. When we bring down the whites, it takes the sting out of those highlights, and it really begins to control those highlights more. Even if you want to bloom out your highlights, like for example, if I bring up my highlights, but then I bring down those whites, it's just controlling that look a lot more. And probably actually the best way that I can show you as an example is going to my tone curve. I'm just gonna create an S curve right here just quick and just show you exactly what I mean. So if my highlights are brought up, let's say that these are my highlights and the exposure overall. And then if we grab the top head of this S curve and you pull that down, look at what that's doing. It's really flattening out those whites. So if you think of your whites, that's kind of what it's doing, is it's flattening out those highlights, kind of taking that sting out. So now if we go bring this up, I'm gonna really over exaggerate that. So that's like that. And if I bring that down, it's taking the sting out and deepening those whites overall. So that's kind of what our whites does. I'm gonna reset that. Now we go back into our basics here. I'm gonna pull those highlights down again. See more of the sky. I'm going to pull down those shadows a bit because I mainly want my rider to be kind of silhouetted. And so I'm gonna pull down those blacks, and because it is a little bit too dark, I'm not seeing as much information in the bike. I'm just gonna pull those shadows just a hair, just so I see a little bit more of the environment. A lot of this is very subjective on how you want to do your overall lighting. I love to pop up the clarity just a little bit, give a little bit more sharpening to my overall image. But generally what happens when you do that is your highlights begin to pop up a little bit more. So I'm just going to pull those down a little bit more again. I'm just going to bring up the exposure overall just a little bit. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the basics, and generally what I like to do is I like to go into manipulating my HSL in colors first. So this is the kind of view that I have set up here. I have it with all of them with the hue, saturation, luminance, but some people like to do them individual with different colors and whatnot, but I like to have them all available because then I can kind of move them as I need. What I'm going to start off with here is I really want to control these yellows because these yellows are not going to be flattering at all to my overall environment. So I want to push a teal and orange look. So if I want to do that, these trees need to be more orange and the sky needs to be more teal. So let's just start pushing in that look. So I'm just going to start pushing those oranges. You're gonna start seeing these trees here. I'm gonna push those yellows. Perfect. Push those oranges so like the trees are almost like that burnt orange. And I'm going to bring up the saturation on those oranges, saturation on those yellows up, and then I'm actually gonna pull those down to about -10. And I'm going to show you how I can control that. So I want these trees here to be more on the desaturated part, but as you notice, like if I pull the greens left and right, it is manipulating them a lot, but there is still a little bit of yellow that's manipulating these trees. So if I want to have these trees desaturated, I'm going to pull them down here, push them a little bit more towards the yellow because it's going to fit the environment better. It's going to fit the overall mood of these warm highlights kind of casting onto the trees. I'm really going to desaturate those greens here. Perfect. I'm going to bring up, yeah, so see if I bring up the yellows like full, you're going to see it in the trees, some of the highlights of the trees. You're going to see it in some of the grass here. So we'll grab this color individual for that tree and we'll manipulate that after. So just going to reset that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to manipulate the sky. So I'm going to go up to the hue of the blue. I'm going to pull that more towards the teal. And now I'm going to pull that down more. Okay, perfect. So generally what I like to do is I most times like to have my sky a lot more muted. Some people like to keep it boosted and some people love those really oversaturated colors. Personally, this is my style. You can do really whatever you want with that, but this is what I like to do. And so now I want to manipulate this red. This red is looking more pink and I want to match kind of the orange tone. So I'm gonna pull this more up towards the orange. I'm gonna bring up the sat on that, and I'm going to pull that more towards the orange here, and then I'm going to bring down the saturation a little bit. So saturation's at +38. I'm gonna bring down the luminance on the red just a little bit, just that it brings up the saturation a little bit more. So whenever you bring the luminance down on a color, it's going to raise the saturation up a little bit. So you need to remember that as you decrease the luminance on something, then you also might need to manage the saturation. So I'm finding that the yellow might be a little bit too bright. So I'm just gonna pull that down a hair to -6. Okay, perfect. So this is kind of a good base for now where we can go into our color grading. And this is where I like to really push in my look. So generally I'm going for those warm highlights. So I'm gonna pull up to about, let's say about like hue 41. And that's going to be kind of sitting between like this golden orange and this yellow. So I'm just going to give a little bit more boost on that saturation. And it's all kind of figuring out where you want to sit. So if I go up too much, I'm seeing that it's just unnatural to the sky. So I'm just going to pull that down to about +25. And then we go to the midtones. I'm gonna push in that same look here to give like that warm midtone. Perfect. Let's go +15 here. Okay, now let's go into the shadows. And so you'll notice that the blacks are starting to push more towards that warmth because that's what's in the midtone. So we need to balance that out. So we're gonna go the opposite of what we pushed in at hue 209. Just gonna push in a little bit, so at about +7, and that's going to start neutralizing these blacks. Okay, so after doing all these colors here and manipulating, I'm noticing that the colors are a little bit unsaturated. So I'm just gonna boost up those colors a little bit with the saturation. I don't usually like to do that first. I like to kind of do that after, as I need to like add up more saturation to colors. So I'm just going to boost that saturation. I'm going to go back into the color. I'm going to manipulate those yellows again, bring those down. Okay, perfect. Now let's go into our masking here. And now that we kind of got a bit of a look that we got going on, this is where we start to really shape our image. So what I like to do is hit the plus icon, go to linear gradient. I'm just gonna scale out a hair, pull up from kind of that gray space there, and really feather out this mask here. So what's affecting this image is the red, and you can see that it's kind of dying off at around that wheel level there. So I'm probably going to adjust that after I do some corrections with this basic corrector here in the mask. So I'm going to bring down the exposure. I'm gonna bring down those blacks here. I'm gonna bring down the shadows. Really kind of deepen the bottom part of the frame because we want our subject to be the main focus. So we're gonna pull down that mask there. What you'll notice that when you start decreasing the luminance, as I had said, you're gonna start increasing some of the saturation in that color. So we're going to pull the saturation down so that nothing in the bottom is going to pull your eye where it's oversaturated more than other parts of the image. So we're gonna pull that saturation down, gonna straighten out that mask a little bit there. And now what we're gonna do is we are going to grab a radial gradient here. And this is where we're gonna really push our highlights within those highlighted tones here. So I'm going to keep it right about here. I don't want to go too far out. One thing I love to do to bloom my highlights is come down to this point that says dehaze, and I'm going to push that to -17, and you'll notice that it's starting to bloom. So I'm going to turn that off, turn it on, off, and on, and you can just see how much it's blooming. So I'm going to pop the highlights here. I'm going to bring down the whites a little bit. And naturally what that does as well is it will start to fade and wash out the parts of the image that's hitting as well, like my rider's arm and my rider's leg. So to correct that, I'm generally doing a contrast raise. I'm lowering the blacks just so that it's not overtaking. So I'm gonna turn that off and turn it on, off and on. And the reason why I like to bloom up my highlights like this is because it really fades in my sun or the points in the image that maybe are kind of spotty from clouds, where the sun is just kind of like fading out and like you're seeing little spots of clouds, and it just doesn't look as nice. So I love to just bloom those highlights, really pop them and make them just flow into the image that much nicer. So I like to do that with the dehaze. That is like one of the secrets, I guess, to how I like to bloom my highlights. So the dehaze is a great tool, especially when you're using the mask icon. So now what we're gonna do is we're going to do another mask. So we're going to hit the plus icon, go to select subject, and look at the magic on that. That's just insane. I love this tool so much. It's insane. So let's go to add some more contrast. Let's bring up the exposure. We want our subject to be the main focus, so we want them to be bright as well. So we're gonna bring some more contrast. We're gonna go down, like to boost the clarity up, just that they're nice and sharp. And then we're gonna bring down some of those highlights because we don't want those highlights to be too strong on our subject. And I'm noticing that the rider's arm is a little bit washed out. So I wanna make sure that that's still staying very firm. So I'm gonna bring down the blacks a little bit, just a hair, -5. Okay, now let's see what this is like before and after. So that's before and that's after. Before and after. So it's drawing a lot more attention to our subject now, even though yes, they are still kind of silhouetted and some of these darker parts are still fairly dark. I don't mind that. I'm pretty happy with that. So now what we're gonna do is we are going to go into a color selection. So if I go into color range here, click on that. Now, if I hover over this yellow part, as I said, I want to manipulate that. I'm gonna click on that. And now I'm going to scroll down. I'm gonna go to the hue. I'm gonna push the hue more towards that orange. Not too much where it looks unnatural, but just, I would say about that much. So now if I turn my mask on and off, that's off, that's on, off, and on. So you can see how much attention we're drawing to our subject just by doing that. And this is the image before, this is the image after, before and after. So So it's really starting to tie in and pull in our look that much more. So now I'm noticing that this image is still feeling very cold, and yes, we could go with a look like this and say that we're done, but there's a couple things that I want to show you that I think would really help this image pop. So if we go down to calibration, which is the bottom tab, and we go to the blues, we can really start to push in that orange look. We can raise up the saturation, we can lower it. Just look at how much that's pulling in that teal and orange look. And yeah, we could manipulate the colors that much more. It's so interesting just like how much that really begins to accentuate a look. So it's something that I like to use the odd time. So this is one way that we really could do that, and we could even push in a little bit more of those greens, desaturate a little bit. And yeah, let's just turn that off and turn it on. Off and on. So you can see that it's really pushing in a lot more warmth. So to finish off, let's do the crop. So you can hit auto here, and that's going to auto level. And sometimes I feel like it can be really wonky. Like obviously this is not level. So I'm gonna hit Command or Control Z if you're on Windows. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna align with these trees right here and right here. So I'm going to tilt like so, drag over, make sure that my subject is in focus. And I love like a 16:9 crop like this. This is always really beautiful. It's almost like kind of a cinematic look. I love this crop so much. The 16:9 wide aspect ratio. It's just really cool. Or if you want to go for Instagram, we're gonna reset that so you can go to as shot, and we can go to a 4:5 or 8:10 aspect ratio. And if we want to use that for Instagram, we can put our subject in the middle. We can go to the right third of our grid here. We can do something like so. Yeah, like there's lots of different things that we could do. Maybe I'll just center out my subject here like so. And yeah, that looks pretty cool. I really like that. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna copy this look, and we're going to translate that over to our next image. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna right click on this photo here. I'm gonna go to develop settings. I'm gonna go to copy settings, and I have everything selected except for masking, healing, crop, and transform. So I'm going to copy, I'm going to go to my next image, and I'm going to be on the thumbnail of the image, and I'm going to right click again. I'm going to go to develop settings, paste settings, and you can see that things are a lot different than the last one. So we'll fix that, but the first thing that I really want to correct is the straightening. So the reason why I chose this image was for a few reasons. There is some motion blur to this photo. There's motion blur within the tire. There's some motion blur within the subject. They're not perfectly sharp, and a lot of that's just because there's a little bit of motion blur, and I was okay with that. I know that in a video recently I said that we don't want to choose an image that is flat, that isn't sharp, but something that we could do with this image is really make it look like there was some good motion blur there, and we can do that in Photoshop. But I just thought I would love to show you guys how I can kind of take an image that isn't like perfectly in focus, but then bring a little bit more sharpening, a little bit more texture, clarity to the subject, just to kind of pull back and kind of like tip them over the edge where they do look sharp. That's only like a worst case scenario. So I just wanted to give you guys a good example of that. Even though, yes, I had said that I wouldn't normally choose photos that are not sharp, I want to give you a good example in case if there's a photo that you absolutely love, that you really want to utilize and share. So one thing that I really want to fix here is the alignment. And that was another thing that I talked about in a last video, was the alignment. But within this photo, I believe that we can pull a good alignment out of this photo. So we're going to go to the crop, and we're going to hit auto. And actually the auto on this one worked really well. So you can see that it's correcting with this grass line here. And I actually think that it was perfect with its correction, which I'm happy with that. Okay, so let's leave this in a wider aspect ratio, just like from camera. So I'm going to center up my subject here, and I'm gonna hit enter. So a lot of the reason why I chose this image too is because it is a little bit washed out here in the tire, because the sun was right here. And generally when the sun is kind of in your photo, you're gonna get a little bit of that washed out. So that was another reason why I thought this would be a really great example. So now with this color grade, there's a couple things I'm noticing is off. So these oranges are looking more red. The red here on the rider is looking a little bit more pink, you know, kind of pushing in a way that I don't really want. The sky's a little bit too desaturated. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna fix a few of these things, and it's gonna be very, very easy, very, very quick. So we're gonna go to the color tab. We're going to grab these oranges. We're gonna pull them a little bit more towards the yellow, and we're at about -32 right now. And as we do that, you're seeing that this is more of that golden orange, not so much of that red. And so as we do that, we're noticing that this isn't so pink anymore, but we're gonna take our reds as we're zoomed in here, and we're gonna push more up towards our oranges to +23. And then we're going to take our magenta and also push that all the way up to 96, because as you can see up in the helmet, up in the top part here, if we push that way, it's purple. If we push this way, it's now red. And so that's what we want. So I'm okay with that. I want to pull up the luminance a little bit on that red, make sure that it's not dipping too low. Now what we're going to do is we're going to bring up the saturation on the blue a little bit, just so that we're not completely losing our sky. I'm going to pull the hue a little bit more towards that teal. Perfect, so now that it's warm here, I'm going to go up to the mask, and I'm going to grab a linear gradient mask. I'm gonna pull out, just like I did before, pull up from the bottom, make sure that's really feathered in. And I want my subject to be the main focus, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna deepen that. We're gonna pull down the exposure, we're gonna pull down the blacks, we're gonna pull down the shadows, drag this down, drag it out, tilt it. Now, if I turn this off and turn it on, it's just fading into that tire a little bit, not too much. I mean, maybe what we could do is we could pull it down just a little bit more, just so that this dust that's being kicked up from the rider's tire isn't being lost, but I'm pretty happy with that. What I'm noticing is that there is a little bit of saturation pumped in this grass, so I'm gonna drag that down, and I'm noticing that there's a little bit of red. So I'm gonna desaturate this here, and as I desaturate it, it looks like it is going a little bit more to the blue. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the temperature slider, I'm gonna slide it over so that we're still pushing in those warm highlights there. Now to fix this washed out part within our rider here, we're going to do a subject selection. Nice, what a good pull on that, that was sick. We're going to pump the contrast. We're gonna raise up the exposure a little bit because I feel like we were losing a little bit of our blacks down in there. So I'm gonna raise up the blacks. So I'm gonna pump the contrast even more here. I'm going to raise up the clarity, make sure that our rider is really popped. We're gonna have to bring down those highlights because when we pop the clarity, those highlights really seem to get boosted. So now what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to bring down those blacks again. And it's hard because this part of the image is a lot lighter and this part of our rider is a lot darker. So what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to do a little bit of an adjustment, and so we're gonna have to do a bit of a brush here. So I'm gonna take the brush and I'm going to grab the size. I'm going to increase the size here, and I'm just going to basically paint over our tire here, paint over the parts of our image that seems to be a little bit washed out. So even down to the lower parts here of the bike. And okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're going to boost the contrast. We're gonna lower the blacks there. Okay, now as I turn that off and on, maybe the contrast is a little bit too much, so I'm just gonna bring that down. So now let's turn all the masks off and on, off and on. Okay, so now, as I had said before, I love fading out my highlights. So I'm just going to grab a radial gradient. I'm going to stretch that out. I'm going to turn it out so that it's bringing more attention into my rider, because we want our light source to be directing attention to our rider. So I'm really going to feather that out, make sure that my feather is really high on that. So the feather is at about 82. Gonna go down to my dehaze and start pumping in that dehaze there. Now we're gonna go to contrast, because what happens when we do the dehaze, it seems to kind of take a lot of detail out of our image. So we're going to boost the contrast, we're gonna lower the blacks, and that's going to control these areas within the tire, within the fender, and we're going to bring the shadows down. We're gonna extend that out, that mask, So that's more into our subject. Let's turn this off and on, off and on. Now I'm finding that it is really blooming those highlights nice. Now I'm noticing that my subject is a little bit too dark, more dark than what I would like. So I'm just gonna go into that subject selection again, bring up a little bit of those shadows on my subject. And maybe what I'll do so that my subject is the main focus and not so much the bike that's being selected is I'm going to go to subtract here, and I'm gonna do a brush. I'm gonna increase the brush size on the subtract. I'm gonna paint that over the tire and over the parts that tend to be more washed out. And that's just going to select the parts from this bike that I don't want to increase with some of that highlight. So now as we turn that off and on, off and on, you'll see that it's just the rider and this part of the bike that's being affected. So I like that a lot more. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm going to do a linear gradient. I'm gonna pull it in from the side here like so, bring it over, tilt it down, pull down the exposure a little bit. I just wanna direct all my attention to my subject. I'm gonna do another one from the opposite side, right in here like so, turn it out, bring it down, pull the exposure down. Cool. Go before and after. That's perfect. Now our light source is directing more attention to our subject is brighter, and now we achieve the same color grade. Let's go to the RNA here just to get a bit of a view on if we achieve the same color grade. And I would say that we have a very similar, if not the exact same color grade, and you wouldn't be able to notice a difference. So I'm really happy about that. Now our last image is going to be a lot different of an environment. It's a lot warmer of an environment rather than our other ones, and there's a lot more dust. So this is going to create a whole different dynamic, but we're going to create the same look. So we're going to right click on our last image that we just graded. I'm going to go to copy settings, hit copy. And the reason why I'm copying the last one that we graded versus the first one is because I feel like the environment was more similar to this one, especially with those bright highlights here. So I'm going to right click on the thumbnail, hit paste settings. So we have a similar look, but we're really gonna have to control a lot because there was more sky here. So we're gonna have to bring up the luminance on the sky a little bit more. We're going to have to bloom out those highlights. And I don't think we can have those highlights as warm within the sky. I think the highlights here are fine within like the grass, within the dust, but we're going to have to kind of neutralize the sky here. So what I'm gonna do is first neutralize that sky. So I'm gonna go into the color grading. I'm gonna go to the highlights, and let me just turn this eye off and on, off and on. So yeah, the sky, let's just pull that saturation right down on the sky. Let's go into our midtones here. I'm gonna pull that down a little bit to about 35. Now I'm gonna go into the color. I'm going to pull down the saturation on the sky, boost up a little bit of luminance on the sky, not much. +6, I think. Actually, let's go +8. Now, I would really like to keep these colors nice and saturated. I don't want to keep them too dull because right now like they are fairly unsaturated, and I do want to bring it a little bit there. So we're going to bring up the yellows to about -3, and we're going to push the hue more towards that orangey red that we would see in our last image. We're going to bring down the aqua. We're going to bring down the blue and the saturation. So now we're starting to get more of the look within the sky of our last image here. Okay, so now I'm really happy with what the shot is starting to look like here. So what I'm going to start doing is shaping it with a mask. So I'm going to actually first do a crop. So I'm going to hit auto there just to line it up. Really easy, just very quick, and go to my crop. I'm going to go to a 16:9 because I feel like that fits this image really nice and it's going to look really cinematic. So I'm going to hit enter on that. I'm noticing that my rider isn't centered there with the bike, so I'm gonna pull that in a little bit more. Hit enter, okay, perfect. So now I'm gonna create the mask here. I'm gonna go to linear gradient, pull up from the bottom, drag my mask down, really feather it out, drop those shadows, desaturate because we don't want that to draw our attention. Pull the blacks down, desaturate again. And now let's manipulate that sun. We're gonna do a radial gradient. You know the drill. So we're going to pull that out, go to dehaze, pop out the dehaze. We're going to have to add more contrast, lower the blacks, just to make sure that our subject doesn't get washed out. So let's turn that off and on, off and on. So it's actually drawing a lot more attention to our subject, which I love. So we're going to hit plus, subject selection. We're going to hit the contrast. We're going to lower the blacks, raise up the exposure overall, and I'm going to go down to the clarity, pop the clarity, and lower those blacks. Okay, perfect. Now, if we really wanted to, we could boost a little bit more saturation in those yellows, kind of really get the vibe going on this, because it is kind of like that sunset vibe, that golden hour, and I think it would tie well with our other images. So as long as our sky is neutralized, the sun's neutralized, then I think that this will be fine. So let's just pull the yellow a little bit more orange here and bring the orange a little bit up towards the yellow. Okay, so now this is kind of like that warm golden orange, and then we have like this teal blue that's not too overdone. So I'm gonna bring up the luminance a little bit on this yellow, keep going to about plus 30. And then let's go to our basics. Let's bring down those highlights more, bring down the overall exposure. So now if we really wanted to push in that tone a little bit more, you can come down to calibration. You could really push that blue down to like that warmer. You can boost the saturation. You know, you can really start playing with these looks, something that is fun to do. And I mean, we could leave it there if we wanted to. Let's go to the RNA version. Now this is a lot more desaturated than what this is, and so it's really just up to you. I mean, like, we could go back to our other images once we see this and we could say, oh, okay, well, we want more saturation. So, you know, we could go to this one and just kind of copy something from this. So we could really take this more towards the orange there, boost things up more, and we could lower the saturation. We could take the orange more towards that yellow. Now this is a lot similar to this, right? The only thing we would need to do is just lower the blues there on that teal. But overall, 3 different images. So we've got this one, and our original. 3 completely different looks, but they can still look as though they're part of the same series. I mean, this one, yes, it does have a lot more warmth to it, but we could desaturate it just like that. It honestly just depends on what you're going with, what you want to go for. So if we want to desaturate that to make it look like the others, now it has a similar vibe, similar tone, and it's very similar to what we've got going on in the others. If we just reset this calibration here, yeah, now it's a lot more similar to our other images, and realistically, it's all just how you want to push your images. I would love to hear your comments and feedback on this video specifically. If you'd like me to do more videos like this, please comment down below, giving me your thoughts, because it helps me to gauge what you guys would like to see in the future. So if you'd like me to do more videos just like this, comment that down below. And if you want to see more videos from this series, you can click on those videos in the playlist icon on the right of your screen. All right, I'll catch you over there. Peace.